welcome to On the Media's very first live stream ever.
Good afternoon, I'm Joe Baker, a member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians.
Hello and welcome to the 13th and last episode of Punishment and Profit, an educational webinar series about the prison industry presented by Worth Rises and the Green Space. I'm Bianca Teilig, founder and executive director at Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of those it touches. For our final episode today, we're talking about investors, the entities and individuals that both financially prop up and collect from the $80 billion prison industry we've spent the last 3 months talking about. A little later in the show, we'll talk to Morgan Duckett, Jim Baker, and Elizabeth Parisian. But first, I'd like to introduce Phuong Luong. Phuong is an investment strategist with Adesina Social Capital, where she manages their social justice investment portfolio process. She evaluates, maintains, and champions the social justice values of the firm in partnership with investors, data providers, and community partners. Phuong's work is deeply informed by her understanding of current and historical barriers to financial wealth for so many communities in the U.S., which she derived from her own upbringing, experience as a public school teacher, and former nonprofit professional. Phuong is also a financial planner for individuals and families. Welcome, Phuong.
Thank you so much, Bianca, for having me.
So let's jump right in. Everyone always asks, how am I exposed to the prison industry? So let's just start there. How exposed are we? What's the chance that I'm directly invested in the prison industry if I have money at work anywhere? And more importantly, how?
So I'll start by giving a quick answer. And that's to say, yes, absolutely. The majority of us are likely to be exposed to the prison industry in some way, either through our investments, our pensions, where we do our banking, the platforms we use for our investments, and the financial institutions where we open our accounts. And what I'll talk about specifically today right now is how we're exposed to the prison industry through our investments. So either in our brokerage accounts or in retirement accounts like IRAs, which are individual retirement accounts, or retirement accounts through our employers, like 401ks or 403b accounts. And the minority of Americans who own investments in companies actually own them through retirement accounts. So that's going to be a really big one. And so I'll start with one of your questions where, what does it mean to be directly invested in the prison industry? And so to answer that, I need to start with what is a publicly traded company, right? And so these are large companies that are listed on a stock exchange, like the New York Stock Exchange. And if you've ever seen a movie where stockbrokers are running around in a big open space, yelling and waving around paper, like buy, 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 sell, 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 that's a stock exchange. And that image in movies was my first exposure to the financial world, right? And so you as an investor can buy a piece of a company, also called a share or a stock of that company. And in the past, we had to go through a stockbroker, like the one I just described. But now technology makes it possible and really simple for folks like you and I to go online and to buy a share of a company stock. And the other type of investment you could purchase and own is a bond, which is basically debt, where you lend money and the bond is the IOU, right? So a bond is a legal document saying that the borrower has to pay you back with a certain interest rate. And so to summarize, you could either own a piece of a company through a stock, or you could be lending to that company through a bond, right? And what complicates this even further is that financial companies also own stocks and bonds on companies involved in the prison industry. So you can see that it's really a web. And so the last question you asked was, how do they end up in them themselves? All right, so I'll get to that now. So even if you've never bought an individual stock or bond yourself, you've likely heard or seen of names of investments such as target date retirement funds, like with a date like 2030 or 2040 or 2050. And these are types of funds such as index funds, mutual funds, or ETFs, which are basically baskets of stocks and bonds. And these have hundreds or maybe thousands of companies in that basket, in that fund. And these are typically investment choices you'll have in your retirement accounts. And so stocks and or companies involved in the prison industry will likely be in there. And this is because you don't allocate your funds or choose your investments. You're relying on the fund manager that manages that mutual fund or index fund. And companies exposed to the prison industry are in that basket. And so you likely don't know whether or not you're engaged unless you look into the holdings of that fund, and you can get that list, right? You can download a list and look at it. But I mean, there's just so many in there, and they also get updated regularly. So it's really hard to keep track as an individual investor.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways. And as you said, it seems like pretty difficult to kind of like learn it. I mean, I'm thinking about these platforms, right? You mentioned like retirement platforms for folks who are, looking at target date funds or things of that sort. And, Vanguard, for example, is a huge retirement platform that many people are really familiar with. Fidelity, another one. And in fact, those are the largest owners, two of the largest owners of private prison stock, right? Even like the more specific private prison stock that everyone's always most concerned about. And so even just by being exposed to their platform, you might not be invested in that specific corporation, but you're invested through the corporations or the investment vehicles that invest in them. So like what I hear from you in this discussion is that the prison industry can hide in a lot of different financial vehicles that we like invest in. But many people seem to think that if they divest from the three major private prison corporations, CoreCivic, Geo Group, G4S, that they've divested from the prison industry. Now, hopefully not anyone who's been following the curriculum, because we've talked a lot about many of the other companies, but to bring that point home, can you explain why divesting from private prisons is not enough to say you're divested from the prison industry?
Yes, absolutely. And you're absolutely right about the companies that you've mentioned. And it's not enough because the prison industry goes beyond the three major private prison corporations into services that Worth Rises has covered in the curriculum and in your reports, right? So services such as architecture and construction, staffing companies, transportation, healthcare providers, telecommunications companies, food and commissary companies, and surveillance companies, among others, including companies who utilize the labor of people who are incarcerated, paying them very little for the work they do while incarcerated. And so this wouldn't, like you said, not a surprise to any of the students or listeners and followers of the work of Worth Rises. Then there are also subsidiaries of the larger companies, right? And so subsidiaries are owned or controlled by another parent company. And so you may not know the name of the smaller subsidiary company that's directly involved in the prison industry, but you may know its parent company, which is what makes the research from Worth Rises so important, because the report uncovers those relationships. And in addition, I mentioned earlier that what complicates this even further is that the financial companies also own stocks and bonds of companies involved in the prison industry, right? And facilitate investments into the prison industry. So these large investment firms that you've mentioned are really well known and are likely administering and housing your IRAs, 401ks, and other investment accounts. And so again, it's definitely a web. And so it's not just important to focus on the three major corporations, but really the whole system.
Yeah, super helpful. And I think that clarity, right? Like specifically, when we think of Vanguard, for example, as you said, it's like you can't actually own a Vanguard stock. Like Vanguard itself is not a publicly traded company, but you own pieces of mutual funds that they manage. They're facilitators, as you say, of these investments. And just to put some names to some of the corporations that we're talking about, corporations that are deeply involved in the prison industry that we've heard throughout this whole curriculum are companies like Aramark, right? The major provider of prison food in prisons that sort of created a lot of the atrocities we talked about that week, right? Or 3M, one of the largest supporters of prison labor in the country, a massive conglomerate, or Centene, which is, as you said, a parent company of a subsidiary that operates in the prison industry. So given how ubiquitous the prison industry is in the market, is it really possible to completely divest without hiding everything you have under your mattress? And if not, is it still worth trying?
Yeah. So I've been wearing my hat as an investment strategist and financial professional during our conversation, but I'll take my hat off for a minute and answer that question as an investor, right? Just like our audience, because I have a 401k, and I'm going to just say plainly, it's incredibly hard to be completely divested from the prison industry. It's incredibly hard. And actually, it makes me think of a story. One of my first financial planning clients asked me this question years ago. They asked me for help removing private prisons from their investments. And even as a financial professional, I had a really hard time figuring out how they could do that. But it's what led me down this path to learn more and to learn how entangled the prison industry is with our financial services industry as a whole. And it's what led me to learning about Worth Rises and to hearing you speak, Bianca, right, for the first time. And so a good analogy that I can think of is how difficult it is to divest from the fossil fuel industry, right? Because the fossil fuels are everywhere and cause a huge amount of harm. Right. And it's almost impossible to completely divest from fossil fuels, because even if you're fossil fuel free, we're still invested in byproducts of fossil fuels like petrochemicals and plastics. Right. And so when you think about that in relation to the prison industry, right, it's super hard, if not impossible, for most people to be completely divested from the prison industry, but it's absolutely worth trying. Right. And it's super important to shine a light on company practices so we can make it harder for the prison industry to run its operations. And we can educate each other, our colleagues, our fund managers, our retirement account administrators, pension managers as well, about how important and far-reaching this issue is. And there's a movement, right? The industry is moving from the work of so many activists. Companies and banks are listening and have promised to stop investing or lending to private prison or to prison companies. I'm having a hard time. I'm saying private prisons, but from the work of Worth Rises, I've learned that it's not just private prisons; it's the prison industry as a whole, right? And the work of activists and public education did that, right? Someone like me who learned things as a teacher, learned things as a nonprofit professional, but didn't start learning about how terrible the prison industry is and how related to the financial industry is until I became a financial professional.
That's super interesting. I think that take in particular that, the actions that we take as individual, like retail investors, can influence others, which can influence institutions, which can influence the broader market, I think is really powerful to talk about what that, sort of trickle effect is. So before you go, and I want to make a disclaimer here, you are not giving investment advice on this call. We are not any of the folks on this particular episode. We are not giving financial advice. Please consult your financial advisor. But Phuong, what guidance would you offer to viewers who are interested in starting the divestment process?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so I'll share some actionable things people can do. But outside of your investments, you can share knowledge, like you said, Bianca, and you can enact your voice as a consumer as well, even if you don't have money to invest directly, right? So avoid doing business with companies that are involved with the prison industry. If you do have investments in the public stock market, your approach may need to be different depending on where your investments are. So, and a piece of advice I give to everybody I talk to is to make a list, right? To get organized. In financial planning, we would call this list your balance sheet, and it's a fancy term for a list of all your savings and all your debts. So I recommend first list all your accounts, right? And on the asset side of things, that's your cash, that's your investments, 401ks, IRAs, your home if you have one. And on the other side of the list, it's the debt that you have, right? Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, all that. And so assets and debts. And as a life skill, I recommend updating this list maybe once a year to stay organized. And so looking and thinking about your asset accounts, right? So for investors with employer retirement plans like pensions and 401ks, your investment options are limited to what the administrator chooses in that fund menu you get when you start your job, or sometimes once a year if they update that menu. And so we need products like index funds, ETFs, and mutual funds to not have exposure to the prison industry. And that's difficult to find, but you can share information with your retirement plan administrator because they choose the investments in your plan. So they need to be taking a much more deeper dive into the investments they're choosing that their employees have access to. If you work with a financial advisor, like Bianca mentioned, share with them the materials you've learned about from the curriculum and ask the advisor to divest from companies you've identified by that have been identified by Worth Rises as being part of the prison industry. And also your advisor may be choosing individual stocks for you, or they may be investing in funds, those baskets of investments that we talked about. Now, if you are managing investments on your own, you have more of a choice, right? You have more choices in your accounts as an individual investor in your IRA or taxable brokerage account. And there's an online screening tool from a nonprofit called As You Sow, and that's sow as in SOW. That's taking an important step that provides an online assessment of funds. And they have an online screener that focuses on just two aspects of the prison industrial complex, which is private for-profit prison operations and prison service providers, and also companies involved in the militarization of borders and the policing of immigration. And this is research provided by the American Friend Services Committee. But what we've also learned from the curriculum and Worth Rise is that the prison industry goes beyond those two sectors, right? But the screener for As You Sow is a great start for the public to have access to evaluate their investments on their own in a simple way. And the last thing I'll share is that going back to the balance sheet, the other side of your balance sheet, not just your assets, but also your debt. So on the debt side of the balance sheet, consider where you're getting your mortgage, right? Consider refinancing your mortgage if you're looking to refinance or getting a new home with a local credit union or something called a CDFI, which is a community development financial institution that will reinvest the funds and the money that you're lending to them, or that they're lending to you, and the interest that they're getting from your mortgage payments locally, right? So they'll reinvest your funds locally instead of being in the hands of a national bank that may be investing in or lending to companies involved in the prison industry. And the last thing I'll say more on that is that some people are choosing to be completely out of the public stock market or Wall Street, right? Or by divesting in local businesses, worker-owned cooperatives, and also CDFIs. And to learn more about that, there's an awesome online community to check out called the Next Egg, which is nextegg.org, and to learn from this community about what it means to be locally investing. And some people, a lot of people are somewhere on the spectrum, right? Either all in the public markets or all outside the public markets, but you could be somewhere in the middle too along your journey as you're learning more about the merits of divesting.
Thank you so much, Phuong. That's incredibly helpful and really practical advice for folks. So we'll see you at the end of the show, and I'm sure folks are going to have more questions. To keep up with Phuong's work, visit adesina.com or follow her at pt_Luong on Twitter. A quick reminder that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to use the chat function to pose questions to any of our guests. You can also pose questions on Twitter using the hashtag #punishmentprofit. Our next guest is Morgan Duckett. Morgan is a senior in the Industrial Design Professional Program at Auburn University and the co-founder of Alabama Students Against Prisons. More than 400 strong, ASAP works to build the power of students in Alabama to respond to mounting threats of prison privatization and the expansion of mass incarceration. Morgan led a successful campaign to stop Alabama-based Regions Bank from financing the private prison industry. He's now working to stop the construction of 3 new prisons in Alabama that would dramatically expand incarceration in the state. Morgan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Bianca.
So Phuong taught us a bunch about publicly traded companies and how we invest in their equity and bonds. But there are far more savvy investors than you and I. Among them are investment banks and hedge funds, and they've been investing in the prison industry's equity and debt for some time. In 2019, the Families Belong Together coalition, of whom we had someone earlier in the curriculum, forced 9 major banks to stop lending to private prisons. And yet one of these banks got caught with their hand back in the cookie jar just this month. And you helped hold them accountable. Can you start us off by just setting up the problem before we get into what happened?
Yeah, well, the problem specific to Alabama can really be detailed by a December 9th, 2020 DOJ report or lawsuit against the state that outlines our unconstitutional conditions. The fact that our Department of Corrections is deliberately, quote, indifferent to the needs of our incarcerated people. They regularly allow violence, whether it be sexual or physical, from corrections officers onto inmates or inmate on inmate, because they are deliberately indifferent to the needs of incarcerated here. But that's not new. What is new is the governor's effort to privatize our prisons and expand our capacity through private prisons, our privately owned prisons. She proposed this plan in 2020, and it basically allows for CoreCivic and another shell corporation, Alabama Prison Transformation Partners, to design, build, and own 3 facilities in the state of Alabama. These are mega prisons, they call them, because they hold between 3,500 and 4,000, but knowing our over incarceration rates, it would be closer to 5,000 or 6,000. So they will own these, and then the taxpayers of Alabama will pay lease agreements for 30 years with an increasing cost every year. And right now it's looking upwards of $3.7 billion. And the real catch is that at the end of it, the taxpayers and the state own nothing. So this is an absolute cash cow for the private prison industry and any company looking to profit off of incarceration. So with that deal with CoreCivic, we've been facing some obstacles, figuring out how they are financing this, because the public option was 800 or 900 million, and it failed in the legislature, and it would have gone through a public bond issue. It turns out CoreCivic tried to do the same through Barclays, underwriting bonds offered through Wisconsin Public Financing Authority, which basically provides and rents access to their municipal bonds in order to achieve, better rates and lower taxes on any bonds that would be issued. So what we did is we addressed that. We went straight to Barclays and.
So hold on, Morgan, if I could jump in for 1 second, just to provide some clarity for folks. So what you're saying is there is a DOJ report that said, oh, conditions are terrible, largely because there's a lot of violence and lack of care and all of that. And Alabama's response was, let's build new prisons. Instead of dealing with any of that, then they decided to partner with a private prison corporation to build those new prisons, who promised them ability to go to the market so that they wouldn't have to issue their own bonds from the state. And then they went through the Wisconsin Public Finance Authority, so essentially a Wisconsin government agency that was going to allow are going to issue municipal bonds, so government bonds that have lower interest rates on behalf of CoreCivic, a corporation. And all of that was going to be underwritten by Barclays, which was one of the 9 banks that committed to not financing private prisons again.
Right. Thank you for that context. It's also important to note that because it did fail in the legislature, the governor intentionally circumnavigated any type of legislative approval or approval of the public to order these or issue these bonds. And additionally important that the DOJ report, even their earlier report that we commissioned, then Governor Bentley commissioned, called the Justice Reinvestment Report, doesn't talk about construction. It talks about a working parole system. It talks about updating our sentencing laws. It talks about actual work.
So it talked about actually letting people go.
Exactly, and not building more prisons.
So, okay, so Barclays went to pretty extreme lengths, right? And watching CoreCivic set up several shell corporations for these prisons, going to Wisconsin, why Wisconsin was funding a prison deal in Alabama is still beyond me. And then going to the market. And so Barclays was going through great lengths to help and continue supporting these private prisons. So tell us, what did you do and what happened as a result?
Right, so we had been tracking as closely as we could the financing through Regions Bank, as you mentioned in the intro there, because they were one of the last holdouts for banks that would still offer a line of credit to CoreCivic, who's in our state. And through that coverage, I had spoken with members of the FBT coalition that you mentioned earlier, and because they were curious of our work. And so as soon as we found out that Barclays was involved with this, I did bring it to FBT, the Families Belong Together Corporate Accountability Committee, and we strategized on how to make them hurt for it, and highlight the fact that they were obviously only virtue signaling. They went for the first back channel they could. Granted, it was quite complex financial engineering to get to PFA and municipal bonds, but yeah, so we approached them on that ground. We, in Alabama, our coalition called Communities Not Prisons set up a massive letter writing campaign that was elevated by other organizations, and we ended up sending over 17,000 emails to the underwriters. And so they came in the office Monday morning, unable to do their jobs, is what I would imagine. And
I just want, so for folks to understand, this is, I'm going to intersect with a quick personal anecdote. I'm a former investment banker. We say underwriters, we sound like it's some like major corporation. There's like people like me that were sitting at that desk that got 17,000 emails. I think it was just a brilliant strategy. It made me laugh a lot when we were doing it. Right.
But couple that with the efforts of all of the organizations in the FBT Corporate Accountability Committee, pressuring the equity and social groups like the American Sustainable Business Council to push Barclays out for an obvious violation of what is sustainable and equitable. It worked pretty well, except there is still one holdout in Stiefel, but we're intent on stopping them as well.
Oh yes, we have some things in store this week, right, Morgan? So actually, what happened? Can you tell folks what was the result? You said there was one holdout, but what happened to Barclays? What happened to KeyBank? What happened to the Wisconsin PFA?
Yeah, so they got spooked. They realized that the plan that they were willing to execute was way hotter than they had anticipated. Because apparently this is not something that they had delved in before. But when Barclays withdrew, so did KeyBank. They followed suit, and then PFA similarly said we can't touch this, we can't handle this, and so now we're looking at the option that is being proposed in Alabama, which is a public option, because this private deal is falling apart. It was a huge blow, a huge setback, and in a lawsuit that we have right now, one of the motions for dismissal says that we interfered with their financing at an unsustainable rate, which is huge news. So it was hugely successful, and it sort of proved that that type of organizing does work.
Yes, that's amazing. It was really, I think, for the time spent to be a part of that type of work. And I will say that CoreCivic obviously panicking because of its inability to get financing, and Alabama looking to just drop CoreCivic altogether, then got into a Twitter war with some of us. So that was comical in its own right. In any case, I understand that some of the board of trustees at your university also have some ties to this deal. What were they, and have you done anything to target them? And if I could ask you to keep it a little brief, we're running a little bit behind.
Sure. I can do that. So to put it short, because of the land grant status and public status of our universities here in Alabama, the governor is the de facto ex officio president of the board of trustees on every major public campus in the state. And therefore, we looked to those boards and looked at any of those board members who are involved in the business dealings or the companies involved in this prison deal. And sure enough, on my own campus at Auburn University, one of the appointed board members by Kay Ivey is Raymond Harbert, whose cousin, Billy Harbert, is the owner of one of the contractors, part of the Shell Corporation, Alabama Prison Transformation Partners. So he's set to definitely gain from the construction of prisons, definitely gain from the incarceration of individuals in Alabama. And on our own campus, they committed all of us through proxy to mass incarceration. And so the students in Auburn did hold a protest outside of the Harbert College of Business. We were interviewed by several media outlets locally, yet Harbert never responded. But we believe that pressure is important to maintain and to keep spotlighting where these powerful individuals are making these deals.
Well, congrats on that as well. So it sounds like the deal is on its way out, but we know that we must always stay vigilant. And so what in this moment are you most worried about?
So definitely worried that this bank that is insisting on staying in Stifel will try to issue private placement of bonds, right? I think Phuong went into this earlier about these secretive ways that the money is still there, and this would allow all of those virtue signaling companies or investment firms to pretty much buy in or lend without having their name publicly disclosed. However, we hope that the downturn of the private prison industry and any industry associated will dissuade people from investing that way. And the other thing I'm worried about is that Alabama still thinks that building new prisons is an option to get our way out of a crisis. The DOJ, issued its solutions. We have a new DOJ. The lawsuit that came through was a Bill Barr DOJ, a Donald Trump DOJ. Now we have a Biden DOJ that has already committed itself to closing and ending its relationships with private prisons. And we could really use their input on the fact that Alabama is dead set on putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound by building new prisons instead of actually addressing the needs of its citizens.
Thank you, Morgan. And I hope that, we get to be successful in completely dismantling that deal. So thank you so much for your work, and we'll see you again at the end of the show. To learn more about Morgan's work, follow Alabama Students Against Prisons on Twitter at ALAgainstPrison. Next, I want to bring in Jim Baker. Jim is the executive director of the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, which works with community stakeholders impacted by private equity investments to divest institutional investors from the industry. In his work, Jim has helped expose the impact that private equity has had on incarcerated people and their families and divert hundreds of millions of dollars from the hands of prison profiteers in the industry. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Bianca. Good to be here.
So, continuing on from this past conversation, Morgan started to tell us about private placements, a way that public and private investors invest without much visibility or scrutiny. Private equity is yet another one of those obscure investment vehicles with incredibly limited oversight, where many of our institutions are invested. Can you briefly explain what private equity is, as I don't think many understand it and think they'd like to keep it that way, and who exactly invests in private equity?
Yeah, definitely. So, Phuong talked earlier about all sorts of different investments in stocks, all sorts of investments in stocks through funds. This is, private equity is different, right? So it's not traded on a stock exchange. These are, investment firms that go out and buy whole companies, right? And they, to sort of get the money to do so, they raise money mostly from institutional investors. So pension funds, funds that provide for people's retirement, or university endowments, or foundations, or foreign sovereign wealth funds, or rich people, et cetera, right? There's a variety of institutional investors who are kind of make up the bulk of investors in private equity.
And why is that, Jim? Why is it that it's primarily institutional investors that are in this field and not people like you and me?
Well, you have to be an accredited investor. So you have to have, assets of, I forget what the number is, but assets of a certain amount in order to invest. You're presumed to be a sophisticated investor to invest in private equity. But it's also quite opaque, right? It's you're not required to. They're not required like a publicly traded company to disclose, at least on, to the public, what they're invested in. So, it's hard to, they're not required to disclose who their investors are. So it's, it's actually quite hard to keep track of, what's of sort of private equity funds and private equity industry.
And I imagine that, those accreditation requirements are also because they have pretty high thresholds for how much you can invest, right? The reality is that you can't invest $100, $1,000, even $1 million.
Yeah, no, often you'll see investments of $1 million or, for big institutions, 50 million, 100 million, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in a particular private equity fund, which will then go out and, buy several, maybe dozens of companies, right? Now, those companies, could do lots of different things, but, some of them, as we found, are, directly profiting off of incarceration, directly profiting off of, people who are incarcerated.
So that leads me to my next question, right? So why should we be concerned about private equity, especially with respect to the prison industry? How big a role is private equity playing, and what's its impact been? And if you could share a few examples, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is an area that is underappreciated. I think that I think just to start off kind of why we should be concerned, sort of kind of a segue from what I was saying before, these are very opaque investments, right? So many of these companies operate behind the scenes, but their decisions can have, very significant impacts on incarcerated people and their families. So, private equity firms own the largest phone and communications companies serving prisons, so Securus and GTL. They own the largest healthcare company, WellPath. They own the largest commissary company, TKC. It's sort of, there's some private equity owned company profiting off of just about every, jail or in some way, right? Whether it's through, money transfer services, whether it's through, telecommunications, et cetera, for just about every incarcerated person there is, right? So they really, they touch and you all have covered many of these services in, previous installments, they touch really every aspect. Also, they also are profit heavily off of electronic monitoring. So even community corrections, when folks are, outside of facilities, private equity firms are still finding a way to profit off of incarcerated or detained people.
And it's important for people to know that private equity, these are financiers. These are not people who are actually good at running those particular types of businesses. They're just good at running businesses. And when we say good, really that means extracting as much possible wealth and resources out of businesses. And so for them, these businesses are just like every other, and they sort of act like that. And one of their major roles that they've played in this field is consolidating and creating monopolies in so many of these. So when you mention the private equity's grasp on prison telecom, for example, 90% of the industry in prison telecom is held by private equity firms, and in fact, 90% is made up by just 3, 80% by just 2. And so one of the largest roles that they've been playing is actually the consolidation of all of these. So at the end of the day, who is actually profiting off of all of this harm, off of the harm that they're causing in telecom and healthcare and commissary, right? This exploitation, who stands to benefit?
I think I also sort of think back to Phuong's presentation at the beginning. In some ways, it's also all of us as well, although in slightly different ways, right? So, it ranges from anybody, from people receiving pensions, right? It ranges from, like I said, university endowments or big investors in private equity, and thus are profiting off of prisons and incarcerated people. But there's, so there are institutional investors like that, But also, let's be clear, there are some extremely wealthy individuals who are the private equity managers who run these private equity firms who are profiting the most, right? So
you're talking about our best friend now, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. So I'll just, yeah, right. So no, right. I mean, so you mentioned Securus, right? The one of the two companies that that really dominate prison telecom. Tom Gores, who's the also owns the Detroit Pistons, is a billionaire. Is right, is the head of Securus, the head of Platinum Equity, a private equity firm that owns Securus, and so is poised to profit dramatically off of the exorbitant calling rates that the company charges, off of exploitative practices of Securus. And so while we can in some ways we all are, but private equity the folks who run these firms really are the ones that strive to profit the most, right? And they're, I mean, just to sort of, as I think you alluded to, their focus is 100% focused on, can they grow cash flow for themselves in 4 to 6 years or something like that? And they're like, what they do is 100% focused on that, kind of in some ways, regardless of the impact that it has on people that are incarcerated, right? And so it could be consolidation, it could be raising prices, it could be cutting costs and therefore cutting the quality of medical care or the quality of food, et cetera. And so, you can see the real harms caused by some of the sort of actions of these firms that are, 100% focused on, how can I wring more money out of this company, or as much money as possible.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that is important for people to note is that while we will, unfortunately, in many ways, pensioners and others stand to benefit from some of this stuff, the reality is that we don't have decision-making power, right? Like Tom Gores actually has decision-making power over the practices of these corporations, right? And it's really important for us to identify that. And I'll just say that, I think Tom has made a number of silly remarks in the past, but one of my favorite was certainly when he tried to say he didn't own Securus. And we're playing semantics here, sir. You own the company that owns Securus, and so it's silliness like that they're trying to get away with as they're causing an incredible amount of harm. And so, in closing here, there's a misconception in the public that if a corporation is privately owned, that there's simply nothing you can do to influence it, right? We heard from Phuong and we heard from Morgan in large part about divestment strategies. And so the question, around here is that there is work that we've done together, in fact, Jim, over the years that dispels this myth. Can you share some of the examples of ways we've been able to deter investments and prevent further harm in the prison industry by targeting the private equity sector?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that absolutely, right. I think that it is absolutely a misconception, and it is this is as important of an area to focus on, because at the end of the day, and I mentioned many of the largest investors in these are actually public entities, right? Public pension funds or et cetera, right? Whose money is ultimately funding these investments. And are supposed to be publicly accountable, right? So Platinum Equity, I'll just give the example, right? When they a couple of years ago, when they last raised a fund, upon sort of learning more about Platinum Equity's investment in Securus and frankly being concerned about that investment, a number of large institutional investors were I think quite concerned, right? And so took different steps. Some, delayed their investments. Others only made the investments contingent on the, Platinum Equity promising not to invest more money in prisons. Another, the Pennsylvania State Employees Retirement System halted a $150 million investment in Platinum Equity purely out of, or I could say all their reasons, but certainly out of concern for the kind of things that this private equity firm was invested in, right? So, they've drawn public scrutiny from investors. They've drawn public scrutiny, thanks to Worth Rises. Tom is resigned from the LA County Museum of Art board, right? So this is, they've drawn public scrutiny other places. And I would say it's increasingly, even for, although it's private, although it's, somewhat opaque, it's increasingly, toxic, right? The investing in prisons is increasingly seen as toxic, so that, just like investments in Geo Group, CoreCivic that folks were talking about previously, right? So, TKC, the largest commissary company, also provides food service, phone service, et cetera, which is owned by HIG Capital, another private equity firm, recently, just tried to raise debt. And I think, really as a part of this broader push, both on private equity, on the lenders to, struggled to raise debt, to refinance their debt. So I just think that there is this growing sense across all areas of both the risks of investment in this area, and they're just increasingly seen as toxic. And that that's absolutely true of the big publicly traded companies, but that absolutely extends to private equity and other investments as well.
Absolutely. And I'd say, in some ways, in fact, targeted work around private equity can even be more effective because they're not quite the size of a major publicly traded company. They don't have as many stakeholders that have decision-making power. And you have, for example, folks like Tom Gores who can be targeted directly, right? And that, and the headache that he's had from us, removing him from the LACMA board. And, one of the strategies that we employed very intentionally was ensuring that, no one spoke about Securus without speaking about its owner, Platinum Equity and Tom Gores. And that, because of that, there's a lot of other people saying, wait, I don't want this headache, right? And so you mentioned the TKC deal. I love seeing investors out there saying, wait, you do what? Prisons, what? I'm good. That is not an investment that I'm trying to make. So Jim, thank you so much. To keep up with Jim's work, please visit pestakeholder.org. We'd like to remind everyone that you can share questions in the chat on YouTube or Facebook, or by using the hashtag punishmentprofit on Twitter. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the program. Our final guest today is Elizabeth Parisian. Elizabeth has worked in the labor movement for over a decade as a strategic campaigner, researcher, and communicator on corporate accountability campaigns. She currently leads the Capital Strategies program at the American Federation of Teachers, most recently supporting campaigns exposing the risks of investing workers' capital in private prisons and hedge funds. Prior to joining AFT, Elizabeth worked on campaigns including Hedge Clippers, The Fight for 15, and Stand Up Chicago. Elizabeth, welcome.
Hi, Bianca. Thanks for having me.
So Jim helped us understand the breadth of institutions that are invested in the prison industry, specifically around private equity. We heard from Phuong and Morgan about the broader public market. You represent many of the board members of some of those, the largest investors, namely teacher pensions. Many of these are public pensions, as Jim said, that have actual public accountability. Can you start by helping us understand how these pensions make investment decisions and the role of their board members?
Sure. So if you're a public employee, like a state worker, government worker, or even a teacher, chances are you participate in a public pension fund, which means that you're paying part of your paycheck, every paycheck, into the fund. Your employer is paying in, and this money is collectively pooled in the pension fund and invested. And so public pension funds are generally governed by a board of trustees. And usually the trustees will include at least a couple labor affiliated trustees, right? So these are either active members or retired union members who are elected by labor, and they sit on the pension fund and make decisions. And then a board of trustees will often have political appointees or other ex officios like the state treasurer, right? But they're the decision-making body for a pension fund. And typically they have some kind of oversight over investments, right? Whether that's an investment committee or whether they're actually interviewing investment managers themselves. But the Board of Trustees is the entity that makes decisions about how pension dollars, ultimately signs off on decisions on how pension dollars are invested. So if pensions, it's really important to remember that pension funds are workers' deferred wages, right? Like, this is workers' capital. So if pensions are invested in things that hurt public employees, right, or are bad for the economy that they live in or the communities that they live in, then it's absolutely appropriate for pension participants to raise concerns about those investments, right, with the pension board. I mean, I think others on this panel already pointed out that, public pension fund is accountable to the public, right? They have to be transparent. They have to put out annual reports. They have open meetings. They typically take public comment. So their pension funds as investors actually have an element of public accountability or public oversight.
It's so interesting because I'll say quickly that specifically the campaign that Jim mentioned around the Pennsylvania State Employees Retirement System involved pensioners writing op-eds and things of that sort. And we've actually testified at multiple pension board meetings, and I can tell you very few people coming to publicly testify at pension board meetings. So great place to make an impact. So these pensions often have billions of dollars. I mean, in particular, state employees retirement, but teachers' pensions, really, really huge pensions, which means that they're likely very exposed to the prison industry, given how much money they have and what we've learned earlier about the ubiquity of the field. But it also means that they have incredible power. Can you explain how you assess both the scale and power with respect to a pension's ability to create change?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. I mean, public pension funds are some of the largest institutional investors out there. So if you look at just public pension funds in the US, they manage assets estimating about $6 trillion. To put that in context, that is larger than the GDPs of most countries, right? Like, these are huge pools of money. Therefore, and like others have pointed out, pension funds are pretty broadly invested in the stock market. They're heavily invested in private equity, right? So these are major players, particularly when it comes to private equity. Now, I should point out that over the last few years, especially, a lot of public pension funds have been divesting, at least from publicly traded private prison companies, right? So they're starting, through the good work that you and others are doing, are starting to take notice that this actually might be something that we don't want to be investing public dollars in. But when large institutional investors like public pension funds make a move, the markets notice, right? Like the CIO of the California Teachers Fund, he muses about the state of the economy, and that's news, right? And so I think a good example of this is we saw some of the larger pension funds over the last couple of years, the California funds, the New York funds, assessing their private prisons investments, deciding that it wasn't worth it to remain invested in these things. And then we saw a number of other pension funds and banks and other entities follow suit. So, and it's important to point out too that companies need investors, right? It's not like pension funds are out there, begging companies to take their money, right? I mean, it's the other way around, right? Like, if you're a private equity firm, you need to raise money. You're going to get your money, from large institutional investors, because you need hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So I think that's, in terms of the power that a public pension fund has in the market, it's important to remember that, right? That actually, like, the companies and private equity firms that are involved in the prison business, they're the ones who are seeking capital, right? And pension funds are the ones that have the capital. Super important. And I think, like, one example that I just want to offer for folks is to say that, in fact, the pensions in Europe, Dutch pensions in particular, that happen to be among the largest in the world, played a huge role in getting pharmaceutical companies to stop manufacturing and distributing death penalty injection drugs by actually divesting their funds, because the EU does not allow for the death penalty. And they didn't care whether the US allowed for it or not. They knew that their money wasn't going to be invested in those corporations. So divestment from these major institutions is incredibly powerful. But one of the things we hear so often when we're doing this work and speaking to stewards of institutional funds, including pensions,
is about this concept of fiduciary duty. Can you explain the concept of fiduciary duty and how it is often improperly used to avoid socially responsible investing?
That's a really good question. So in general, if you are a pension fund trustee, you have a fiduciary duty to the fund, right? It's not your money, it's someone else's money. So what fiduciary duty means is you have to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries, right? It's fairly simple. You have to have a duty of loyalty, meaning you act only in the interest of the participants, and you have a duty of care, right? So you have to do it diligently. You have to take it seriously. Somehow over the years, fiduciary duty has kind of been misunderstood or manipulated, and some people are under the false impression that fiduciary duty means it is your duty to make as much money as possible for the fund, to seek the highest risk-adjusted returns, period, and you can't consider anything else. And that's really not true. And I think it's actually very much a part of someone's fiduciary duty to examine investment risks, right? You have to look at holistically at your investments, right? It's not, and again, public pension funds are long-term investors, right? They're not day traders, right? They're in it to pay out benefits 30 years down the line, right? So they really have to take a look at what's going on with their investments, right? Like in the example of private prisons. I mean, we've heard all kinds of examples, right? About how, they mistreat incarcerated people, and there are all kinds of additional gross negligent acts that they commit. And so, if you're a pension investor, you're invested in a private prison company, let's say, and they're appearing in the headlines all the time because incarcerated people, they're separating families, or that are being detained at the border, or not providing health care to incarcerated people, et cetera. That's a risk to your investment, right? Like, you don't want to be in the headlines all the time. There's also regulatory risks, right? So, regulators have got their eye on the prison industry, right? Because of all the atrocities that we've heard about. There's also legislative risk, right? We just saw that President Biden, one of the first things he did when he came into office was to say we're not going to use private prisons for, at least in federal prisons anymore. And so there are all kinds of things that put that investment at risk that don't have to do necessarily with the immediate bottom line, but actually have to do with the stability of your investments, right? And so we would say, workers' retirement money is at risk if they're invested in things that are harming workers and communities and the environment.
Absolutely. In fact, I really like that you brought up the fact that, for most pensions and retirement funds, right, they are planning for 30 years out. And so the question is, like, what's a dollar going to be worth if the world is burning down, or if their communities are not the communities that we want to be living in, right? And so I think that's really powerful. So just in the last minute or so, if you can take us home, how do you specifically support members in your role as a union advisor in taking these courageous and sometimes unpopular stances? And how can members of the public hold these public pensions accountable for how their taxpayer dollars are invested?
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So we have AFT members serve as pension fund trustees, right? And we want to provide support to them because this is a tough job. And most labor affiliated trustees, they're doing this in addition to their regular full-time job, right? And so a huge part of what we do at the AFT is we provide education to trustees, right? We have a trustee council where we get our trustees together and we share information. We invite workers to speak. We invite, representatives of different campaigns to give them information so that they can actually get information and bring it back to their fund and help them make good decisions about their fund's investments. And it does take courage to especially be the first fund or one of the first few funds to do something, right? Because pension funds are under a lot of scrutiny. And so for a trustee to say, hold on, I have questions here. I don't feel right about this. It takes a lot of courage to speak up like that. And so I think it's, if for the public or for anyone who has concerns about how public pension dollars are invested, they can absolutely reach out to the pension fund. They can reach out to trustees. They can speak at public meetings. But I would just say, don't assume that it's going to be a contentious discussion off the bat, right? Because a lot of, at least speaking for labor affiliated pension fund trustees, a lot of them share the same concerns, right? Like they live and work in the same communities. Teachers don't like the school to prison pipeline any more than anyone else, right? And so you may actually have a very receptive audience and someone who can actually then, work to have the pension fund invest differently.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And to follow Elizabeth's work, follow AFT Union on Twitter. If you haven't yet, now's the time to drop your questions in. We may try to take one or two. We are running a bit over today. But before we do that, here are my takeaways from this week's discussion about investors in the prison industry. There are over 4,000 corporations operating in the prison industry, hundreds of which are publicly traded subsidiaries of publicly traded conglomerates and private equity owned. Even smaller corporations borrow money from familiar lenders. In other words, we're exposed to the prison industry every day, more than we could ever grasp. Last year, we released the most comprehensive data set on the corporations in the prison industry. The data is informing a growing list of tools to help us divest from the industry. As you heard from Phuong earlier, As You Sow has put out a tool that evaluates mutual funds and their exposure to at least the major players in the prison industry. FreeCap is developing a scorecard system to evaluate corporations' relationship to mass incarceration. AFSC's Investigate provides divestment advice on the most egregious actors. Open Invest has a screen for retail investors that divests from private prisons and leans into companies that hire formerly incarcerated people. And we've recently partnered with Divestment to develop the most comprehensive screen for the prison industry, which should be released later this year. And while we're all working to divest, there are people still suggesting that private prisons and other corporations in the prison industry are a good bet. In fact, just yesterday, an article with investment advice came out calling Geo Group stock a, quote, value stock you want in your life. Despite, and I quote again, of course, there's something unsavory about investors benefiting from the misery of others. But that didn't stop them. Apparently, neither did the fact that the same day, Geo Group announced it was suspending its dividend payouts and reconsidering its REIT, both indicators of negative performance. But hey, I'm not here for the investment advice on Geo Group or any other corporation. The bottom line is that as awful as the stories of the last 13 weeks have been, advocates are really starting to win, and we invite all of you to join us. Phuong is working with investors interested in divesting. Morgan is forcing accountability in banks that have committed to stop funding private prisons. Jim has successfully blocked investments in prison profiteers. Elizabeth is supporting pensioners every day looking to divest their futures from prisons. We at Worth Rises are moving policies to stop the extraction of wealth. We see students at universities like Harvard demanding that their endowments stop supporting incarceration. The list of corporate accountability campaigns is endless, and these wins have had windfalls far beyond their targets. Just as Jim started to tell us earlier, just this past week, one private equity firm went to market to finance a really basic loan deal for a commissary company it owned. In fact, the largest commissary company in the field. But the bad press of the year coming from things related to prison investments that hit Barclays and Platinum Equity and Tom Gore's and that growing laundry list have suffered in this time around their investments in the private prison industry has given investors pause. In fact, so much so that they couldn't raise the money they needed, even after dramatically lowering the amount that they were going to market with and increasing the yield. And that's important because it limits access to capital and it makes capital that they do have access to much more expensive, which will likely drive these financiers that have invested in this space for many, many years out. These investors that have created these harmful monopolies, financed tough on crime politicians and lobbied for punitive laws may in fact no longer find this market lucrative. And with their exit, doors open for the type of transformational and abolitionist change we want to see. So in closing, I want to just explain that corporations are not these ominous bodies, neither are investors that can act with impunity. There are, in fact, people at the helms of these corporations and investment firms making decisions every single day. They have names, they have faces, they have families. And it's our job to take them to task. And so with that, I'll bring back all of our guests just for a question or two. Let's see what we have. Thank you all. So I want to start off and say, let's see, okay, for Jim, there is a question around private equity, and actually I'll sort of pose this question to Jim and maybe Phuong as well, around the notion of foundations in the criminal justice field. I think we talked a lot about the fact that the reality is we're probably all exposed, but how should foundations that are actually funding criminal justice work feel about their investments perhaps in the prison industry and work to divest? And I'll get just a quick response from Jim and from Phuong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they should be incredibly concerned about, if they're about sort of investments that might be, directly working counter to, what their mission really, right? So I think they should be incredibly concerned about investments that are directly counter to their mission. And what I would say is we encourage investors, whether it be pension funds, foundations, endowments, et cetera, to first raise these issues with the private equity firm and encourage them to exit their investments in prisons and commit not to make further investments in the space. Absent that, though, if that private equity firm is unresponsive or unwilling to, then they should take their business elsewhere, right? They should not invest with that firm anymore.
Thank you, Jim. Phuong, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. So parallel to what Jim shared, and also in line with what I shared for individual investors, foundations have even more capacity to do a really in-depth look and x-ray into their investments, not just on the private equity side, but also in public equities. And so Activism Social Capital is one of the organizations, one of the companies that actually would look through and look at foundations investments and evaluate them, right? But you can work with a financial advisor, you can work with anyone to review your foundations investments, to do that in-deep screen using Worthrise's data, using the data of other organizations that you shared, Bianca, to divest from the prison industry as a whole.
Thank you so much, Phuong. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for because we are over time tonight. But I want to thank all of our guests for joining us tonight. Phuong, Morgan, Jim, and Elizabeth, thank you. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us, not just tonight, but for the past 13 weeks as we uncovered every corner of the prison industry. Thank you also to all the amazing staff at the Green Space, Jennifer, David, Ricardo, Veronica, Sachi, and Cameron, for their incredible production support over the weeks. And finally, thank you to our staff at Worth Rises, Taylor, Luke, and Jan, without whom none of this would have been possible. For those of you who want to keep tonight's conversation going, as always, to ask more questions or share your final reflections on the curriculum, please join us as we head over to Clubhouse for our last public study group. Follow me at Bianca Tyler to find the room. If you'd like to learn more about our work at Worth Rises or support our work, please check us out at worthrises.org. To stay plugged in going forward, please sign up for our newsletter and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Worth Rises. For the last time, I'm Bianca Tyler. Good night.